October 1962. The Cold War is at its height. The United States and the Soviet Union are on the verge of thermonuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis. But a secret danger lies just beneath the surface. 4 nuclear-armed Soviet submarines confront the United States Navy. New information reveals that Soviet subcommanders had independent authority to fire their nuclear torpedoes.
We came that close, within a hair's breadth of nuclear war.
This is a story about human judgment and human error, a lesson in the failure of communication and the triumph of restraint. In 1961, the Soviet Union and the United States raced for nuclear supremacy in the air, on the ground, and under the sea. In October of that year, submarine commander Nikolai Shumkov is chosen to test the Soviet Navy's latest weapon. It's a nuclear-tipped torpedo designed not just to sink a single ship, but to take out an entire fleet. He takes his Foxtrot submarine to an area known as Black Harbor, on the remote island of Novaya Zemlya in the far Russian north.
Торпедный аппарат пли! Есть торпедный аппарат пли! Пли!
It's an experience Captain Shumkov will never forget. The Soviets are lagging far behind in the arms race. In the spring of 1962, Premier Khrushchev comes up with an audacious plan to redress the balance, one that will bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. September 1962, Polyarny submarine base. Captain Shumkov and 3 other submarine commanders receive an extraordinary assignment. It's shrouded in secrecy and given the codename Kama. Ryura Ketov, Alexei Dubivko, Valentin Savitsky, and Nikolai Shumkov are all in their early 30s. Well-trained, the elite of the Soviet Navy. They realize this will be no ordinary patrol. The mission comes with authority never before given to Soviet submarine captains. They have permission to fire nuclear torpedoes without any direct authorization from Moscow.
The sub's personnel were very well prepared for the use of atomic weapons. They could do it at any moment, under any circumstances. Just give the order.
Before leaving on their mission, the 4 men make a pact. Captain Ketov remembers.
We made it between us absolutely clear, especially on that grey subject of usage of nuclear weapons. If one of my friends would deploy nuclear weapons, I would deploy them too.
October 2nd, 1962. With nuclear weapons in place and packets of sealed orders, the 4 Foxtrots slip out to sea.
Our orders were to open the envelopes after we left the Kola Bay. That was when we first learned we were headed for Cuba, Marial.
No Soviet submarine has ever been sent on such a long-distance mission before.
We plunged into it head first, knowing nothing of the international situation. We just went in blindly, without knowing what was in store for us.
American President John F. Kennedy is haunted by Fidel Castro's Cuba, a communist outpost only 70 miles from America's shores. Special counsel to the president, Theodore Sorensen.
Relations between the United States and Cuba had, of course, been troubled since the Eisenhower days when Castro took over Cuba and soon turned toward communism.
In the spring and summer of 1962, President Kennedy orders military training exercises, including anti-submarine warfare. And a mock invasion of a Caribbean nation. It's an opportunity for Kennedy to warn Cuba and her Soviet allies. He wants to assure the world that his military machine is battle ready. Cuban leader Fidel Castro has befriended the Soviets. It's a friendship Premier Khrushchev can use. He's desperate to restore the nuclear balance, and with it, his own political prestige. Codenamed Operation Anadir, Khrushchev turns the island of Cuba into an armed stronghold. At the heart of a massive defensive buildup are 36 medium-range SS-4 ballistic missiles and 2 longer-range SS-5s. The power of their warheads ranges from 200 to 800 kilotons, 10 to 35 times the explosive force of the Hiroshima bomb. The Soviet submarines are the final element of the force to leave for Cuba. They are given only 3 weeks to get there and are under strict orders to do so in complete secrecy, to preserve Khrushchev's plan.
The crossing had to be covert. Just as any submariner, we were aware of the enormous responsibility implied by that word. The responsibility for not letting ourselves be detected.
The Foxtrots are diesel-electric submarines. The air-gulping diesel engines propel them on the surface at a steady speed of 18 knots, or 21 miles per hour. When they need to hide, they submerge using battery power, but their speed is reduced to 16 knots, or 18 miles per hour.
At that time, in October, there was already daytime and nighttime in the Arctic region, so we took advantage of the nighttime to emerge and make some headway on the surface.
At CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, Director John McCone is worried. Something is going on in Cuba. He's been requesting U-2 spy plane flights over the island, but bad weather has been hampering missions. Cloud cover is hiding activities below. So far, Khrushchev's secret is holding. October 13th, 1962. The stretch of ocean between Newfoundland and the Azores is the U.S. Navy's main anti-submarine barrier. It is patrolled by American planes and ships. Their sole purpose is to detect any and all Soviet submarine activity.
By the time we reached the main ASW barrier, that is, the Newfoundland Azores line, we were quite positive we were under surveillance.
But in fact, the 4 Soviet Foxtrots slipped through just in time. Sensing trouble over Cuba, the United States Navy increases its sub-hunting activities in the Atlantic. The U.S. Navy isn't the only concern. The submarines run into a fierce mid-Atlantic storm.
I've never, in my whole career at sea, seen anything like it, either in the Pacific or in the Atlantic, or anywhere at all. It was terrible. Force 9 or 10, the fixtures on the diesel engines, the manifolds were all bursting open. We had to take one of the diesel engines offline constantly to be able to fix it, not to mention the way sailors were thrown against bulkheads as they tried to walk.
The subs are battered by the violent seas.
All our outboard hatches had two lids, and one of those got depressurized during that storm. That did limit our submerging capabilities.
Finally, the storm abates. Now, 4 young Soviet submarine commanders with nuclear torpedoes and a pact for firing them are heading closer and closer to unfriendly waters, just as Khrushchev's secret is about to be discovered. The consequences will put the commanders in the middle of what may be the world's first nuclear war. Sunday, October 14th. An American U-2 spy plane climbs into the upper atmosphere over Cuba. The clouds have cleared. 70,000 feet below sits Khrushchev's secret, exposed to the camera's eye. Monday, October 15th. The film is rushed to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington. One of the analysts is Dino Brugioni. At first, he thinks he's looking at anti-aircraft missiles.
The surface-to-air missiles are only 34 feet long. Well, these, on our measurement devices, kept coming up 65 feet.
Brugioni and his colleagues look for a possible match.
I opened the book in front of Vince Lorenzo, and there's a picture of the SS-4 being trundled through the streets of Moscow. And he said, "That's it." And I said, "Are you sure?" And so, again, to make sure, we did a number of measurements, and the measurements all kept coming out 65 feet.
SS-4 is the NATO code name for a Soviet medium-range ballistic missile. Its range is 1,300 miles. The Soviets are amassing enough missiles on Cuba to kill 80 million Americans within minutes of launch. And they will be operational within a week. Tuesday, October 16th. President Kennedy is briefed.
Mood was grim. The president was determined upon the removal of those missiles.
But how to do it without touching off a nuclear war? Only a few hundred miles from the American coastline, the Soviet subs are closing in on Cuba.
By mid-October, the situation had become very tense. Each sub had a radio intercept team which used to intercept communications between the US and British forces, and it was getting to be quite alarming. It was obvious there was trouble brewing, not just in our vicinity, but in Cuba proper.
President Kennedy calls a meeting of his most trusted civilian and military advisors. This group will become known as the Executive Committee, or EXCOM. It includes Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and Theodore Sorensen. The options range from the diplomatic to the military. The American forces are ready to go, but it is the president who will have to decide. The man who watched his military rehearse 6 months earlier now contemplates a real invasion of Cuba.
The attack that the advisors were recommending was a huge attack. The first day's airstrike, 1,080 sorties, more than any day in the Kosovo War.
At the 11th hour, a new alternative emerges. McNamara advocates a naval quarantine of Cuba. The Navy will stop Soviet shipments to the island until the missiles are removed. Kennedy agrees. But neither the president, McNamara, nor EXCOM know of Premier Khrushchev's underwater threat, the 4 nuclear-armed submarines. The U.S. Navy is preparing to enforce a quarantine line around Cuba, an arc that extends 500 miles into the Atlantic. Much of the fleet is already at sea. Those still on shore are scrambling to get ready. Newport Naval Base, Rhode Island. Rudy Rump is a radar man on the USS Blandy, a destroyer that's part of a carrier group designed to hunt submarines.
A number of guys try to make phone calls from the base communications center. while those of us who were not lucky enough were restocking the ship. And approximately 9 o'clock that night, or 2100, we got underway.
The USS Blandy is heading for 26 degrees north, 68 degrees west, the rendezvous point for the Essex carrier group. The USS Essex slips out of the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Aboard her are squadrons of specialized aircraft designed for hunting down and killing submarines. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. For USS Cecil Captain Charles Rozier, the crisis also means a sudden return to active duty.
I reported to the base, and the Commodore says, we want to send you out on a little mission here, so you better have your wife get you some clothes to the ship. I said, how long is it going to be? I don't know. Where are we going? I can't tell you.
The Soviet Foxtrot submarines have reached the Gulf Stream. The warm ocean currents are turning their cold water subs into steel ovens.
People were fainting at their battle stations, up to 14 cases a day, because the temperature in the sub was 150 degrees Fahrenheit, except for the end compartments, which were slightly cooler, no more than 100 to 115 Fahrenheit, where the men went for a breather.
In the high temperatures, the sub's diesel engines are starting to overheat, filling the interior with thick, acrid gases. They must fully surface to ventilate, but this is becoming more and more dangerous. Washington, October 22nd. At the morning briefing, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral George Anderson tells the XCOM it will take at least 10 to 14 days before Soviet submarines can be moved into the quarantine area. So far, the 4 Foxtrots remain undetected, but that's about to change. Later that very afternoon, CIA Director John McCone reports to the XCOM that a fleet of 4 Soviet submarines are in position to reach Cuba within days, not weeks. The Foxtrots have been found. So far, only a few know of the crisis brewing in the seas around Cuba. Along with most of the world, Captain Rozier is about to discover the gravity of his mission. Monday, October 22nd, 7 p.m. U.S. forces worldwide go to DEFCON 3. DEFCON 1 is war. At the same time, President Kennedy addresses the nation and the world.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. Thank you, and good night.
The word is out. A nuclear showdown has begun. Tuesday, October 23rd. President Kennedy signs the quarantine order. Secretary of Defense McNamara briefs the media.
I have taken the necessary steps to deploy our forces to be in a position to make effective the quarantine at 2 p.m. tomorrow, Greenwich time. That will be the equivalent of 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time.
The U.S. Navy deploys the largest American naval force since World War II. Aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, guided missile frigates, and shore-based aircraft. The submarine hunter-killer group, led by the aircraft carrier USS Essex, is stationed near the center of the quarantine line. The destroyer USS Blandy is part of this group. This force will patrol the quarantine line and stop all Soviet arms shipments. The 4 nuclear-armed Soviet Foxtrots and the U.S. Navy are reaching the quarantine line at almost the same moment. But the Foxtrots have a serious problem. While they can receive messages, they themselves cannot raise Moscow by radio.
Moscow was totally jammed. In answer, there was nothing, emptiness. It's like Moscow doesn't exist. We knew things were coming to a head, that trouble was brewing.
On the evening of October 23rd, Kennedy is told Soviet submarines are moving into the Caribbean. He orders the Navy to give the highest priority to tracking the subs and to put into effect the greatest possible safety measures to protect American aircraft carriers and other vessels. The word goes out. October 24th, the Essex carrier group, including the destroyer USS Blandy, arrive on station. They are now actively on the hunt for Soviet submarines. Moscow radios the 4 Foxtrot commanders: carry on to Cuba, break through by any means, and fire if threatened. The Americans have no idea of the firepower these 4 Foxtrots carry. October 24th, President Kennedy fears the quarantine may not work. An invasion of Cuba, or worse, may be necessary after all. (10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time). The quarantine is now in effect. There are at least 30 Soviet merchant ships steaming towards Cuba. 4 of them carry more nuclear missiles. McNamara advises the president that 2 Soviet freighters, the Kimovsk and the Gagarin, are within 2 hours of the quarantine line. They will be intercepted by the U.S. Navy. Then, more troubling news.
There is a submarine very close, we believe, to each of them, and therefore it should be 20 to 30 miles from these ships at the time of intercept, and hence it's a very dangerous situation. The Navy recognizes this, is fully prepared to meet it.
Mistakenly, the XCOM believes the Soviet subs are guarding the ships, a mistake that could spell disaster. Now, American naval ships and the Foxtrots are within firing range of each other.
My surveillance team. I had my own surveillance team. Detected the aircraft carrier Essex straight ahead with its aircraft carrier group. I was the first to come face to face with them.
For the Americans at the interception point, Shumkov is commanding an enemy submarine. It will either be surfaced and controlled or destroyed. For Captain Shumkov, any attack would demand a response, even with a nuclear-tipped torpedo. At the White House, the XCOM discusses what to do about the Soviet submarines. McNamara says the Navy will use 3 practice depth charges as a signal to enemy submarines to surface.
We have depth charges that have such a small charge that can hit the submarine without damaging the submarine. We propose to use those as warning depth charges.
Trouble is, any explosion, large or small, could be interpreted as a blatant attack and force retaliation. This is the time of greatest worry for the president, according to his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy.
If he doesn't surface, we're just going to attack him anyway. We don't want to have the first thing we attack is the Soviet submarine.
Now, Kennedy and XCOM can only wait. Kennedy's naval aide, Tazewell Shepard, remembers the tension.
The one thing the president did not want was for shooting to begin, whether it was in a boarding or an attack on a submarine or vice versa. But he was prepared to take the next step if it had to be taken. And so it was kind of on a teeter-totter. We were on edge.
10:25 a.m. Reports indicate that Soviet ships have stopped dead in the water. Khrushchev reasons that his missiles are already on the island. He doesn't need to run the quarantine line with any more ships. Below the calm Caribbean waters, Captain Shumkov detects American sonar working in the area. He orders a crash dive. This time, Captain Shumkov manages to slip away. Robert McNamara knows what might have happened.
It wasn't until 2001 that we learned that submarine carried a nuclear-tipped torpedo. If that had been used against the Kennedy, nuclear war would have started then.
Despite positive signs, peril still lurks below. 4 nuclear-armed Soviet Foxtrots are being hunted down by the U.S. Navy. Thursday, October 25th. By now, a dozen Soviet merchant vessels have turned back, but others are still heading for the quarantine line. The U.S. Navy also knows the 4 Soviet submarines are in the area. The Navy is using everything at its disposal to find the Soviet subs, including an underwater listening system known as SOSUS. On October 26, a SOSUS contact leads an ASW aircraft to Captain Dubivko's submarine. The hunt is on. Meanwhile, new photos of Cuba reveal troubling evidence. Missile sites are progressing at an alarming pace. Some missiles may already be operational. Saturday, October 27th. The crisis is beginning to spiral out of control. An American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba is shot down. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, is killed. What Kennedy doesn't know is that Khrushchev did not order the plane shot down.
He had specifically issued orders to the Soviet commanders in Cuba not to shoot down a U-2 if it were flown over. The U-2 flew over, it was shot down. This is what happens in military operations. They're so complex, it's beyond ability to ensure that you control all the variables.
XCOM interprets the downed plane as an escalation of hostilities. Kennedy is pressured by his military chiefs to order an airstrike and an invasion of Cuba. He decides to bomb Cuba's missile sites if any more American planes are fired upon.
And we got a new report about the ships coming back toward the barricade. We thought they had stopped in the water a couple of days earlier, this time accompanied by Soviet submarines. Then we got word that most of those missile sites on Cuba were now prepared, ready to go. In all of those ways, it looked very black indeed.
By the end of the day on Saturday, Kennedy and Khrushchev are on the verge of nuclear war. Fyodor Berlatsky was an advisor to Nikita Khrushchev.
This man asked me, did you send your family outside of Moscow? And I asked him why I must do it. And he told me that it can happen atomic blow from the United States. It was dangerous, very dangerous.
If it came to a point of nuclear exchange, the time required for the nuclear missiles to arrive in Washington would allow enough time for the presidential helicopters to take the president out. But our families would probably be left behind. I would not be able to take my wife and son on the helicopter with the president. So it was a grim time.
Sunday, October 28th, 6 a.m. The CIA reports to Kennedy that 24 medium-range ballistic missiles on the island of Cuba are fully operational and pointed at America. 3 hours later, at 9 a.m., a dramatic announcement on Radio Moscow.
Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev will remove the missiles. The public breathes a huge sigh of relief, believing a nuclear war has been narrowly averted. In fact, the danger is far from over. The 4 Foxtrots with nuclear torpedoes in their tubes are not ordered home. They remain a deadly presence. Captains Dubivko, Shumkov, and Savitsky are all being hunted down by the United States Navy. Aboard Savitsky's sub, nerves are raw. He's been hunted for nearly 4 days, but cannot elude the American Navy. His batteries are dry. He reluctantly gives the order to surface.
It was obvious the Americans also knew it was going down, because they were clearly trying to provoke us. When Savitsky emerged, the first thing he said to them was, "Stop the provocations."
Shumkov and Dubivko are cruising within a few miles of each other, trying to recharge their depleted batteries. Suddenly, a danger sign for Dubivko.
Here I am, recharging the battery in order to be fully prepared. And I detect a sonar station working somewhere close at hand. I order urgent submersion, start going down.
Monday, October 29th, 7 p.m. Aboard the destroyer USS Cecil, things are heating up. They have found Captain Dubivko's submarine.
The officer deck reported to me that he had a small surface contact and no light showing. It was about 15,000 yards away. And I said, well, I investigated. As a result of that investigation, that contact suddenly disappeared. So we knew then that it was a submarine.
Captain Dubivko believes his comrade, Captain Shumkov, is in the area.
I figured the destroyer was going for Shumkov because he had been placed right next to me by General Headquarters. So, as I knew Shumkov's battery was in poor condition, I decided, instead of evasive maneuvers, to take the destroyer off his back while it was still alone. I figured I could always lose it afterwards.
In the end, Captain Shumkov is found. American surface forces have detected his submarine. Tuesday, October 30th, 1:15 a.m. The destroyer USS Blandy breaks away from its carrier group and heads for Captain Shumkov's submarine.
Well, when we first picked her up, she was on the surface. As we closed in from 3 different angles, she submerged.
The American Navy is quickly closing in. 1 Foxtrot submarine has been surfaced, but 3 remain somewhere below, deadly and unseen. Captain Charles Rozier of the USS Cecil is chasing Dubivko down. He's nearly on top of the enemy submarine.
Next contact.
Then the acoustic reports. The noise has been duplicated. One of the sources is moving towards our stern. I'm still going down. After a while, the destroyer passes directly overhead and knocks down my aerial. As my second-in-command told me, at that moment my hair turned gray.
Captain Dubivko sees the maneuver as a blatant attack, but Captain Rozier denies it.
Absolutely untrue. Misinterpretation of our maneuvers by that skipper, I think. To our knowledge, he was always at a pretty good depth.
But any misinterpretation could lead to disaster.
My view all along, from the beginning of the time that I got contact with this submarine, was that I didn't want to start World War III.
For Captain Kelly of the USS Blandy, The hunt is also on. Kennedy's orders are to track the subs at all costs. Captain Kelly requests air support from the carrier Essex. He's determined to surface Shumkov's submarine. The American Navy is right on top of Shumkov. Captain Kelly wants to surface the submarine.
We proceeded to, I wouldn't say harass her, but let her know that we were there. We threw a PDC, or practice depth charges over, which are basically a noisemaker, to let him know that we knew he was there.
When I was at the depth of 50 feet, one of the ships moved right over us. All compartments reported noise of the ship's screw propellers. And then the ship fired 3 grenades.
Three practice depth charges are intended as an international signal to surface, but they might also be seen as an attack, an invitation to return fire, even with nuclear-armed torpedoes.
How could I emerge with the ships right on top of me? One was passing directly overhead, others were on all sides of me. There were 4 all told. I went down to about 500 feet.
Instead of surfacing, Captain Shumkov fires a decoy, a noisemaker to throw off the destroyer's sonar. Again, any action can be perceived as a provocation.
You could hear from sonar calling to the bridge to advise the captain that they had I believe they said, torpedo in the water, or high-speed propellers closing. At that point, the captain went over to one of the officers who was in direct communication with sonar, grabbed the phone from him, asked sonar, repeat what you just said. And right after that, the captain tried to get in touch with Sinkland Fleet to get authorizations to fire back if need be.
If it's a conventionally armed torpedo, the Blandy might be sunk. If it's nuclear-tipped, World War III would begin within minutes. Luckily, the submarine's action is determined to be an evasive maneuver, but the orders stand: surface the Soviet submarine. October 30th, 1962, 8 a.m. The destroyer USS Blandy has trailed Shumkov's sub throughout the night. Captain Shumkov has no choice. His batteries are out. His oxygen supply is getting low. He must surface in the midst of the U.S. Navy.
I emerged slowly and found myself surrounded by 4 destroyers. One was about 150 feet from me, another directly ahead, a third one to one side. In a word, they were all around me.
Most American crewmen have never seen a Soviet sub and clamber up on deck for a look. Photos are taken for identification. But this is no photo op. Both the sub and the destroyer are ready to engage. After repeated attempts, Captain Shumkov finally manages to raise Moscow.
We were on the brink of war because during the continuous communication session we received orders to have weapons at standby. To stand by for firing weapons or to be ready to fire weapons. That meant that the next order that would follow would be to fire weapons.
The order never comes. Captain Shumkov's submarine, with 2 of her 3 engines disabled, is escorted out to sea.
At the time, we were not aware that the Russians had nuclear tip torpedoes. Finding out recently, approximately a year ago, that they did, and realizing that they also had one in the tubes at the time, if we had fired at a dummy torpedo, I'm pretty sure they would have fired back with a live torpedo, and that would have been it. And that's, it gives you chills when you think about it sometimes. You realize that we've probably been the first victim of the Third World War.
Now, 2 Soviet subs have been surfaced and identified, without hostilities. But still, 2 Foxtrots patrol the depths. Wednesday, October 31st. Captain Dubivko desperately tries to outmaneuver the American destroyer USS Cecil and her captain Charles Rozier. But Dubivko's batteries won't last, and his men are near exhaustion.
He tried to escape by getting in our wake, which is where we have the least capability of detecting with our sonar gear. That submarine is capable of 15 knots submerged. And he did go up to high speed and try to escape, but we were able to follow his wake and keep track.
The submarine, Captain Dubivko, and his men have reached the end of their endurance. After being chased for 36 exhausting hours, he has very little choice.
Then 2 more ships came, and they all surrounded me on all sides, tight. I tried breaking out, but couldn't do much, considering I couldn't go deeper than 230 feet.
From the start of their mission, the greatest priority was to remain undetected. It's the submariner's code of honor.
I still had to emerge in order to recharge the storage battery, which is just what I did. We were moving side by side with their guns trained at me all the time.
You'd have to time it carefully to make a wide spread in order to hit me. But I couldn't have prevented him from shooting at me.
They are face to face, weapon to weapon. For Captain Rozier and Commander Dubivko, the seconds tick by. One bad decision by either man can have devastating consequences.
He immediately began putting up a little hoist of his colors, his Soviet Union Jack.
Dubivko chooses flags over firepower.
The first hoist I raised for the submarine, the international code signal to the submarine, I think it's Echo Foxtrot, but it means, can I be of assistance?
The Americans asked if I required help. I said no, I did not need any help, and asked them not to interfere with me.
It's a humiliating blow for Captain Dubivko. Yet, had he defended his submarine with one of his nuclear torpedoes, he would have triggered World War III. By November 1st, 3 Soviet Foxtrots have been surfaced, monitored, and escorted away from the quarantine line. Captain Ketov alone has managed to remain undetected after a number of close calls with his relentless pursuers. November 7th, Soviet Premier Khrushchev agrees to allow American inspections of outgoing Soviet ships. The missiles are going home. As a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the hotline between Washington and Moscow was established to avoid bringing humanity to the edge of nuclear extinction. Nearly 4 decades later, the lessons learned are still remembered.
In conventional war, we make mistakes. We understand it. We kill people, thousands, 10,000, but we don't destroy nations. If we make mistakes in nuclear war, one mistake will destroy nations. That was what we learned.
USS Cecil Captain Charles Rozier is awarded the Secretary of the Navy's Commendation Medal. For Captains Savitsky, Ketov, Dubivko, and Shumkov, Operation Kama won't end until their return to base in December. The most difficult mission of their naval careers is over. For them, there are no medals or awards, just a dressing down from the Soviet High Command. But today, the 4 submarine captains are considered heroes in the Cold War with America. Russian and American, officers and crew, the men who met face to face at the brink of Armageddon, are the true heroes. Their courage lies in bravely and wisely backing off, and by doing so, averting nuclear war. Before leaving on their mission, the 4 men make a pact. Captain Ketov remembers.
We made it between us absolutely clear, especially on that grey subject of usage of nuclear weapons. If one of my friends would deploy nuclear weapons, I would deploy them too.
October 2nd, 1962. With nuclear weapons in place and packets of sealed orders, the 4 Foxtrots slip out to sea.
Our orders were to open the envelopes after we left the Kola Bay. That was when we first learned we were headed for Cuba, Marial.
No Soviet submarine has ever been sent on such a long-distance mission before.
We plunged into it head first, knowing nothing of the international situation. We just went in blindly, without knowing what was in store for us.
American President John F. Kennedy is haunted by Fidel Castro's Cuba, a communist outpost only 70 miles from America's shores. Special counsel to the president, Theodore Sorensen.
Relations between the United States and Cuba had, of course, been troubled since the Eisenhower days, when Castro took over Cuba and soon turned toward communism.
In the spring and summer of 1962, President Kennedy orders military training exercises, including anti-submarine warfare. And a mock invasion of a Caribbean nation. It's an opportunity for Kennedy to warn Cuba and her Soviet allies. He wants to assure the world that his military machine is battle ready. Cuban leader Fidel Castro has befriended the Soviets. It's a friendship Premier Khrushchev can use. He's desperate to restore the nuclear balance, and with it, his own political prestige. Codenamed Operation Anadir, Khrushchev turns the island of Cuba into an armed stronghold. At the heart of a massive defensive buildup are 36 medium-range SS-4 ballistic missiles and 2 longer-range SS-5s. The power of their warheads ranges from 200 to 800 kilotons, 10 to 35 times the explosive force of the Hiroshima bomb. The Soviet submarines are the final element of the force to leave for Cuba. They are given only 3 weeks to get there and are under strict orders to do so in complete secrecy, to preserve Khrushchev's plan.
The crossing had to be covert. Just as any submariner, we were aware of the enormous responsibility implied by that word. The responsibility for not letting ourselves be detected.
The Foxtrots are diesel-electric submarines. The air-gulping diesel engines propel them on the surface at a steady speed of 18 knots, or 21 miles per hour. When they need to hide, they submerge using battery power, but their speed is reduced to 16 knots, or 18 miles per hour.
At that time, in October, there was already daytime and nighttime in the Arctic region, so we took advantage of the nighttime to emerge and make some headway on the surface.
At CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, Director John McCone is worried. Something is going on in Cuba. He's been requesting U-2 spy plane flights over the island, but bad weather has been hampering missions. Cloud cover is hiding activities below. So far, Khrushchev's secret is holding. October 13th, 1962. The stretch of ocean between Newfoundland and the Azores is the U.S. Navy's main anti-submarine barrier. It is patrolled by American planes and ships. Their sole purpose is to detect any and all Soviet submarine activity.
By the time we reached the main ASW barrier, that is, the Newfoundland Azores line, we were quite positive we were under surveillance.
October 1962. The Cold War is at its height. The United States and the Soviet Union are on the verge of thermonuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis. But a secret danger lies just beneath the surface. 4 nuclear-armed Soviet submarines confront the United States Navy. New information reveals that Soviet sub-commanders had independent authority to fire their nuclear torpedoes.
We came that close, within a hair's breadth of nuclear war.
This is a story about human judgment and human error, a lesson in the failure of communication and the triumph of restraint. In 1961, the Soviet Union and the United States raced for nuclear supremacy in the air, on the ground, and under the sea. In October of that year, submarine commander Nikolai Shumkov is chosen to test the Soviet Navy's latest weapon. It's a nuclear-tipped torpedo designed not just to sink a single ship, but to take out an entire fleet. He takes his Foxtrot submarine to an area known as Black Harbor, on the remote island of Novaya Zemlya in the far Russian north.
Торпедный аппарат пли! Есть торпедный аппарат пли! Пли!
It's an experience Captain Shumkov will never forget. Soviets are lagging far behind in the arms race. In the spring of 1962, Premier Khrushchev comes up with an audacious plan to redress the balance, one that will bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. September 1962, Polyarny submarine base. Captain Shumkov and 3 other submarine commanders receive an extraordinary assignment. It's shrouded in secrecy and given the codename Kama. Ryura Ketov, Alexei Dubivko, Valentin Savitsky, and Nikolai Shumkov are all in their early 30s. Well-trained, the elite of the Soviet Navy. They realize this will be no ordinary patrol. The mission comes with authority never before given to Soviet submarine captains. They have permission to fire nuclear torpedoes without any direct authorization from Moscow.
The sub's personnel were very well prepared for the use of atomic weapons. They could do it at any moment, under any circumstances. Just give the order.